The city of Jericho, with its imposing walls and great fortress, seemed impregnable. It was known for its strength, its walls that seemed to defy heaven itself. But what can faith do when reason says nothing can be done? Jericho was in the path of the people of Israel, and God had a plan to destroy it. Commander Joshua, with divine leadership and the people's confidence, was about to witness a miracle that would change history. But how would God do this? How could an army without war machines, without siege weapons, without military power, face a fortified city? The answer lies in what many consider impossible: faith. And it was with this faith that the Israelites marched one step at a time against the walls of Jericho. Before we begin the story, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Don't miss the chance to witness God's greatness through this incredible story. Give your like, share with friends, and continue with us on this journey of faith and miracles. Let's discover together the power that resides in believing the impossible. The tension in Israel's camp was palpable. The people stood still, in silence, observing Jericho in the distance. The imposing walls, with their massive stones and towers, seemed almost to mock any attempt at conquest. Those who had witnessed the crossing of the Red Sea, those who lived God's miracles during the Exodus, now faced a new challenge. God's objective was clear. Jericho needed to be taken, but the way this would happen was beyond human comprehension. Joshua, now leader of Israel after Moses' death, had the responsibility of leading this people into a new phase of their lives. He had been instructed by God in secret, and the plan was drawn. The city would be taken not by military forces, but by obedience to the divine word and unshakable faith in God's power. That night, before the mission began, Joshua withdrew to pray. He sought guidance from the Lord, asking for strength and wisdom to face the impossible. It was during this prayer that God appeared to him, saying, "See, I have delivered into your hands the city of Jericho, its kings and its mighty men. You shall march around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day you shall march 7 times. When the trumpets sound, the people shall shout, and the walls will fall." Joshua, with renewed confidence, gathered the officers and shared the divine instruction. They were ready to face the challenge, but the way this would be done still seemed strange to human eyes. Marching around the city in silence, without attacking, without launching a single arrow, was an unusual strategy. But Israel's faith was put to the test, and that was exactly what God wanted, a demonstration of total trust in His word. On the first day, the people of Israel aligned around Jericho's walls, with the priests in front, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. They marched in silence, while the priests' trumpets sounded a solemn melody. Nothing happened. No reaction from the walls. No movement in Jericho's towers. But faith was not shaken. On the contrary, the people followed Joshua's orders with discipline, marking the rhythm of a walk of faith. In the following days, the routine was repeated. They marched around the city without saying a word, with eyes fixed on the walls. During these days, tension only increased. The people of Jericho probably observed from their towers, wondering what that strange behavior meant. Were they preparing for a traditional siege, or perhaps for a direct attack? However, there was no movement except for Israel's silent and constant march. The question that hung in the air was, why did God ask them to act this way? Why march in silence, without any demonstration of military force? The answer lay in the lesson God wanted to teach. Faith is not about acting according to what we see, but about obeying what God commands, even when human logic doesn't make sense. And it was in this context of radical obedience that something extraordinary began to happen within the people's hearts. Their faith was being refined, shaped for the moment of greatest challenge, the moment when God would finally demonstrate His power unmistakably. On the 6th day, Jericho's walls seemed as firm as on the first. There were no signs that something was about to change. The people were tired, perhaps frustrated, but Israel's faith never wavered. God's promises were clear and were being fulfilled step by step with each march. Something was preparing, and on the seventh day, the great revelation was about to happen. The seventh day arrived, and with it, the decisive moment. The people of Israel were in position, ready for what would be the last march around Jericho's imposing walls. Joshua, who had led the people with confidence and faith, was now before one of the greatest tests in Israel's history. God had instructed that this would be the day of final victory, the day when Jericho would fall, not by warriors' hands, but by the force of faith and obedience. At dawn, the people of Israel were in formation, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant in front, followed by soldiers and the rest of the people. The silver trumpets were ready to sound, and expectation was palpable. Everyone knew the most important moment of the journey was about to happen. As on all other days, they began the march. Each step taken seemed heavier than the previous, but trust in God was strengthening every Israelite's heart. The city of Jericho, with its stone walls, still seemed impossible to conquer. But Israel's faith was not based on what they saw, but on what they believed to be God's promise. 7 rounds were made around the city, and each seemed more silent and full of expectation than the previous. Nothing seemed to happen except the sound of trumpets and the firm step of thousands of people. Jericho apparently was not trembling, nor were the walls moving. However, the Israelites knew something was about to happen, something grand that would surpass all human comprehension. The final moment arrived. Joshua raised his hand and gave the order, "Shout, for the Lord has delivered the city into your hands." The people in unison raised their voice in a shout of faith and victory, a shout that resounded like a roar of confidence in God's power. And at that exact moment, something extraordinary happened. The trumpets sounded like never before. The sound reverberated throughout the city of Jericho, and then a muffled crash was heard, like an earthquake coming from within the walls themselves. The stones, which seemed firmly rooted to the earth, began to tremble. The walls, which had been considered unbeatable, began to crack. One of the greatest miracles in biblical history was underway before everyone's amazed eyes. What happened next was something beyond imagination. Jericho's walls simply began to crumble. There was no human force, no weapon that could destroy those fortifications. However, through faith, through obedience and unshakable trust in God's promises, the walls fell, and the city was delivered to Israel. It was not an army of men that brought down the walls, but God's power, which acted in response to the people's cry of faith. Joshua, looking at the city's ruins, knew the victory had not been conquered by his own efforts, but by God's faithfulness and power. The people of Israel, now victorious, advanced to take the city, but knew the true victor was the Lord, who had fulfilled his promise. The fall of Jericho was not just a military victory, but a testimony of God's power to make the impossible happen. Israel's faith, though tested and challenged, was rewarded supernaturally. Jericho fell not by human force, but by divine force, which moved when the people fully trusted in God's word. As the Israelites marched toward the center of the conquered city, they realized something deeper. God had acted because they trusted, and they trusted because they believed He was faithful. The lesson was clear. True faith is not moved by circumstances, but by the certainty that God is powerful to do the impossible. After Jericho's fall, the people of Israel were in a state of ecstasy. The victory seemed a direct reflection of God's promise and the people's faithfulness in obeying every instruction, even when those orders seemed bewildering. However, as in all moments of great victory, the most important lesson was not in the conquest itself, but in the consequences of obedience and the spiritual principles that emerge when living by faith. Jericho, now in ruins, symbolized Israel's first great victory in the Promised Land. The city's destruction was not only physical but also spiritual. God had given clear instructions about what should be done with the city's spoils. "Everything in the city shall be consecrated to the Lord," he told Joshua. "Nothing should be taken as loot or personal treasure. Everything should be burned or consecrated." Jericho's riches were not for human benefit, but for God's honor. This instruction, apparently simple, was a way to remind the people that the victory was not theirs, but God's. They should not forget that everything they had, everything they conquered, should be consecrated to the Lord. And more importantly, the victory was not to be attributed to human effort, but to divine power that had manifested. However, not all Israelites were willing to follow these instructions to the letter. Achan's story is one of the most tragic of this conquest. Instead of following God's order, Achan, a man from the people of Israel, took for himself some of the city's spoils. He hid a Babylonian cloak and some gold coins, wishing the treasure to be his. This act of disobedience, however small it seemed in a man's eyes, had devastating consequences for the entire nation. When the Israelites advanced to the next city, what seemed to be an easy victory turned into a humiliating defeat. Israel's army was defeated, and Joshua, perplexed, prostrated himself before God, asking why victory had been withdrawn. It was then that God revealed Achan's sin to Joshua. He had broken the divine order, bringing curse upon all the people. Achan's story is a severe reminder that obedience to God is not optional nor a suggestion. Disobedience, even in something apparently small, can affect not only the individual, but an entire community. Jericho's lesson was not only in marching around the walls and seeing God's supernatural victory, but also in understanding that obedience to God brings blessings, while disobedience brings inevitable consequences. God instructed Joshua to deal with Achan's sins seriously. After discovering the act of disobedience, Achan and his family were severely punished. The city of Ai was taken, but now with a deep lesson engraved in the people's heart. Victories don't come without commitment to obedience. Individual sin can affect everyone around, and only by following God's orders do true blessings manifest. Furthermore, Jericho's fall taught something crucial about the nature of Israel's relationship with God. Every victory the people achieved, no matter how difficult, was an opportunity to reflect on God's faithfulness. The wall's fall was, without doubt, a miracle, but also a demonstration that when people trust in God and follow His commandments, there is no wall that is impassable, no challenge that is impossible. In moments of difficulty, and when life's walls seem impassable, Jericho's story teaches us that trust in God and obedience to His ways are the key to victory. It's easy to look at physical or emotional barriers and doubt, but when we trust in God's word and act according to His will, no matter how great the obstacles, the walls, like those of Jericho, will fall. Jericho's fall also challenges us to examine our own heart. God requires that we be faithful and obedient, not only in great victories, but in daily details. He doesn't desire only our obedience in grand moments, but also in the most intimate moments of our life. What we do in small details reflects our faithfulness to God in everything. While the city of Jericho fell before Israel's eyes, another aspect of the story began to reveal itself: God's wonderful grace. Jericho, though it was a symbol of opposition to the divine plan, also became a stage for a surprising act of mercy and redemption. In this context of destruction, an unexpected figure arose: Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho. Rahab was a woman with a past that in society's eyes made her unthinkable as a candidate for something greater. But as God has the power to transform the most broken and ruined lives, He used her surprisingly. When Israel's 2 spies secretly entered the city of Jericho, it was she who hid and protected them, helping them escape from Jericho's soldiers. She not only hid them, but also made an alliance with them, asking that when the city was destroyed, she and her family be spared. What led Rahab to act this way? It was faith. When she heard about Israel's God, about his victories over the Egyptians and other peoples, she believed. Rahab's faith was not based on her identity, nor on her social position, but on knowledge of God's power. She recognized Israel's God as the true God, and this faith led her to make a bold and courageous decision, saving the spies and consequently saving her life and her family's. God, as always, doesn't look at appearances or a person's past, but at the heart and faith they have in him. God's mercy extended to Rahab, and the city that was being destroyed was paradoxically the place where the Lord brought redemption to her. By following the spy's instructions and placing a red cord in her house's window, she demonstrated her obedience to the word given to her. And it was through this obedience combined with her faith that she was saved. Rahab, the woman who was seen as despicable by society, became a heroine of faith, and even more surprising, she entered the lineage of the Messiah himself. She is one of Jesus' ancestors, as we see in Matthew's genealogy. Rahab's story is a clear demonstration of how God's grace can redeem even the most broken lives, transforming what seemed irreparable into something precious in God's eyes. She teaches us that faith in God is what brings true change, and that even the most unlikely can be used for God's glory. God's grace was demonstrated not only in Rahab's salvation, but also in the way he made Israel's victory possible. God didn't ask Israel to depend on their own resources to conquer Jericho. He asked only that they trust in him and obey his instructions, however unusual they were. He showed once again that his power is not in our human efforts, but in our willingness to obey his voice. In many moments of life, Jericho's walls represent obstacles that seem impossible to overcome. But like Rahab, we can find redemption and mercy in the most difficult situations. God is capable of transforming even the most desperate situations into opportunities for victory and transformation. And this grace is not limited to one people or one historical period. It extends to all of us. Rahab's act also teaches us the importance of being agents of redemption. When she hid the spies, she didn't think only of her own salvation, but also of her family's salvation. Just as she interceded for her family, we are called to intercede for one another. One person's faith can be the key to many's salvation. Rahab's story challenges us to act with courage, make bold decisions, and be God's instruments for redemption of those around us. Rahab also represents God's mercy toward the marginalized and forgotten. She was not an Israelite, nor a woman with a spotless life. She was among society's worst. But God chose her, used her, and placed her in a place of honor. This shows us that God's grace has no limits, and he can reach and use anyone willing to believe in him. As Israel advanced to conquer the Promised Land, Rahab's story would be remembered as a testimony of how faith and obedience, combined with divine grace, can transform a life and change destinies. She was a transformed woman, not by her strength, but by God's grace, and her story echoes today as a symbol of redemption for all who believe. After the victory at Jericho, the people of Israel were in a state of celebration, with the feeling that nothing could prevent them from reaching the Promised Land. They had witnessed God's power in an extraordinary way, seeing Jericho's walls fall before faith and obedience. But as often happens after a great spiritual victory, the next challenge was right ahead, and with it, the need to learn even more about trusting God, even in the face of adversity. The first obstacle Israel faced after Jericho was the city of Ai. Ai seemed to be an easy victory compared to the fortified city of Jericho. It was a small city, without great walls or impenetrable defenses. Israel's army was confident, and Joshua, with wisdom gained from experience at Jericho, knew victory was possible. However, what followed was a humiliating defeat. The Israelite army was defeated, and 36 men were killed. Joshua, perplexed, prostrated himself before God, questioning the reason for defeat, since they had acted according to God's plan at Jericho. God's answer was clear and direct. Israel has sinned. The defeat was a reflection of a hidden sin in Israel's camp, and that sin needed to be dealt with before victory could be resumed. God revealed to Joshua that Achan's sin, who had taken for himself some spoils from Jericho, was the cause of failure at Ai. Achan's disobedience had caused the defeat, and guilt was upon the entire nation. Joshua then ordered that Achan and his family be brought forward, and the guilt was dealt with seriously. The defeat at Ai was a hard lesson for Israel. One person's disobedience can affect everyone. But just as Jericho's fall was a demonstration of God's power, the victory over Ai would also be a testimony of how justice and obedience could bring restoration. After the sin was dealt with, Israel moved forward again. This time, Joshua followed divine instructions carefully. Israel's army attacked Ai with an intelligent and well-coordinated strategy, and the city was taken. The lesson was clear. Obedience to God is crucial, not only in victories, but also in defeats. Every step taken by faith is important, and sin should never be ignored, for it can be an obstacle on the path of conquest. Ai's story also brought forth a fundamental lesson about how God uses our defeats to teach us to trust Him more deeply. The defeat at Ai was not the end of the story, but an opportunity for growth. Sometimes, it's in our failures and moments of weakness that we learn the most valuable lessons. When Jericho's victory was followed by defeat at Ai, the people of Israel had the chance to humble themselves, seek God's forgiveness, and renew their trust in Him. This dynamic of victory and defeat is a constant part of the faith journey. All of us face moments of success and moments of failure. Sometimes, what seems to be a great victory can be followed by an unexpected challenge. However, true victory is not measured by the absence of difficulties, but by the ability to trust God, learn from mistakes, and continue moving forward. After the victory over Ai, the people of Israel continued toward the center of the Promised Land, facing more challenges, but now with renewed confidence in God. They had learned the lesson that without God's guidance, without obedience to His commandments, they could not advance. God guided them, but they needed to walk in His ways to achieve what He had promised. The story of Israel's conquest in the Promised Land is, in many aspects, the story of our own faith journey. We face challenges and obstacles, victories and defeats, but the central message is that with God by our side, we can always win. Jericho's walls, which seemed impassable, fell not by human force, but by faith in God's power. Thus, the walls we encounter on our path, whether spiritual, emotional, or physical, can also fall when we fully trust in God. God calls us to live by faith, to walk in obedience, to deal with our sins seriously, and to trust that in all circumstances He is with us. The story of Jericho, with its lessons of faith, obedience, justice, and grace, reminds us that the Lord is capable of making the impossible happen when we are willing to trust Him and follow His ways, however challenging they may be. After the victory at Ai, Israel advanced with confidence toward the Promised Land. The battles were far from over, but Jericho's fall had already left a legacy of faith, obedience, and courage that would echo for generations. Jericho was not only the first city conquered, but also a symbol of God's power to make the impossible happen, to destroy barriers that the world considers impassable. Jericho's story would be remembered as the foundation of all conquest, from which Israel saw God's power in action, and how their obedience to the Lord brought fulfillment of promises made to their ancestors. The victory at Jericho was also a deep lesson about the need to depend completely on God, especially in life's spiritual battles. The Israelites had learned that without divine guidance, without faith in His word, and without obedience to His commands, any conquest would be impossible. God had a unique strategy for each battle, and He expected His people to follow His instructions to the letter. Jericho's fall was not just a great military victory, it was a demonstration of how God, in His infinite wisdom, can use methods that don't make sense to human understanding. Marching around a city for 7 days in silence seemed an unthinkable plan, but it was exactly this obedience to what seemed irrational that brought victory. The lesson here is clear. Often, God's ways are not our ways, and God's methods are not our methods. But when we trust in Him, we can see extraordinary miracles happen. Furthermore, Rahab's behavior in Jericho became a lasting example of faith and courage. She, a woman outside society's standards, was chosen by God to be a heroine of faith. Her story teaches us that no one is outside the reach of God's grace. No matter what our past or our position in society, if we turn to God with faith, He can use us to fulfill His purposes. Rahab was not only saved, but became part of the Messiah's own lineage. This reminds us that God's grace has no limits, and that He can transform broken lives into something precious for His kingdom. Jericho's legacy also teaches us about the consequences of disobedience. Achan's sin and the tragedies that followed showed that God's justice is serious and cannot be ignored. Even though God had granted a wonderful victory to the people of Israel, the hidden sin in the camp had to be dealt with. God not only blesses but also disciplines, and His discipline always aims to restore and purify. Achan's sin is a reminder that in our walk of faith, it's essential that we deal with sin seriously and seek holiness in all areas of our lives. In many aspects, Jericho is a reflection of the battles we face in our own spiritual life. All of us face walls, whether of fear, insecurity, doubt, or sin. Sometimes these walls seem impassable, like those of Jericho. But like the people of Israel, we are called to march by faith, to trust in God, and to follow His ways, even when we don't understand the plan. And when we obey God and act by faith, He is capable of making the impossible happen. The fall of Jericho's walls also illustrates the principle that final victory doesn't depend on our strength, but on God's power. The walls fell not because of a great army or human strategies, but because God acted. God used the small, the humble, and the obedient to show that He is the only one capable of achieving great victories. He will always be with us, guiding and enabling us, if we are willing to trust in Him. As Israel advanced to take the promised land, Jericho's lesson accompanied them. True victory comes from trusting God, hearing His voice and obeying His commandments, even when the battle seems impossible. They had learned the importance of depending on God, and this enabled them to face the following challenges with renewed faith. Jericho's story is a story of faith, obedience, and divine power. It's proof that when we trust in God, there is no wall that is too great, no obstacle that is impassable. Israel's victory over Jericho was just the beginning of a journey of conquests, but it established the foundations for everything that would come after. And for us, this story continues to be a testimony of how, with God by our side, we can conquer anything. The walls we encounter on our path can fall, just like those of Jericho, when we fully trust in His power and follow His will.